it was probably more intentional in that I was driven. I hope I'm answering this right, but I'm driven to tell this story because I know stakeholders and the community um, powers um, weren't doing it, weren't going to do it. As a matter of fact, in all visitors bureaus, they all have this history of the community, and there was really no mention of the enslavement. And Hannibal had like 2,000 enslaved people. They landed here with Moses Bates, the founder, but Hannibal had no real recognition of those people and those contributions.
From the river to the valley to the sea. All the places, all the people that you can meet.
Welcome to the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. I'm Dean Klinkenberg, and I've been exploring the deep history and rich culture of the people and places along America's greatest river, the Mississippi, since 2007. Join me as I go deep into the characters and places along the river and occasionally wander into other stories from the Midwest and other rivers. Read the episode show notes and get more information on the Mississippi at MississippiValleyTraveler.com. Let's get going. Welcome to episode 66 of the Mississippi Valley Traveler Podcast. Well, we're going to dive into some Hannibal history today, but maybe not quite in the direction you were expecting. We're going to take a whole episode and we're going to talk about the history of the African American community in Hannibal, something that would have been virtually impossible to learn much about until my guest, Faye Dant, came along. Faye is the founder and director of Jim's Journey in Hannibal, and we'll talk about that during this episode, along with the following topics. We talk about her family history in Hannibal and Missouri. She and her family have been in Missouri for 5 generations. We talk about the lack of recognition of Black history in Hannibal and how that inspired her to take some steps to do something about it, like creating a museum. We talk about what she knows, what she's been able to learn about the first African Americans in Hannibal, the steps that she's taken to research Black history in the community. We talk some about the African American neighborhoods in town and how even parts of Hannibal had sundown neighborhoods. We talk about what that means if you're not familiar with the term. We go over some of the economic opportunities that existed for African Americans historically, the school history, the segregated school history in Hannibal and how that finally broke down, the foundations of community life for Blacks in Hannibal, her experiences growing up during the period when legal segregation was starting to break down, and we talk about a couple people specifically that left their mark, maybe a little bigger than others, Joe Douglas and George Coleman Pogue. And we wrap up by talking a little bit about what she learned about Mark Twain when she was growing up in Hannibal, and her thoughts on how Hannibal presents Mark Twain's legacy today. A wide-ranging discussion. Really enjoyed talking with her, so stick around for that. Thanks to those of you who continue to show me some love through Patreon. Your support makes me smile, and it keeps this podcast going. For as little as $1 a month, you can join the Patreon community, just $1 a month. For that modest amount of money, you get early access to each of these episodes, and you make me smile, so that's something. Go to patreon.com/Dean Klinkenberg to join that community. If you're not a Patreon kind of person, you can buy me a coffee. I have a regular caffeine habit, and I appreciate every little bit that helps me sustain my daily caffeine habit. Go to MississippiValleyTraveler.com/podcast, and you'll find instructions there on how you can buy me a coffee. And at that same address, MississippiValleyTraveler.com/podcast, you'll find a list of all previous episodes of this podcast. You can binge. You can select an episode and look at the show notes for that episode. The show notes for this episode will be accessible through that particular address as well. Well, all right. Let's get on with the interview. Faye Dant is the founder and director of Jim's Journey, the Huck Finn Freedom Center, a local Black History museum in Hannibal, and she is also the author of the book Hannibal's Invisibles. She grew up in Douglasville in Hannibal, one of the oldest African American communities west of the Mississippi River. She is a fifth generation descendant of enslaved Missourians and Civil War veterans. She married another local, Joel Dant, who is a sixth generation Missourian. She earned her bachelor's degree from Oakland University and a master's degree from the University of Michigan. She left Hannibal in 1971, then returned to live there in 2011 after retiring from a career in human resources. As a community historian and the curator of the Jim's Journey Museum, Faye is compelled to tell the stories of Hannibal's ordinary and extraordinary Black community. They all get a place on the walls of the museum. Welcome to the podcast, Faye.
Oh, good. Thank you, Dean. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, let's just jump right into this. You, in your bio, you mentioned you're a fifth generation Hannibalian. How do you pronounce that?
Well, I call it a Hannibalian, but it's actually, I am third generation Hannibalian, five generations here in Missouri. My great grandfather was enslaved here, brought from Virginia, and then my grandparents actually moved here to Hannibal in 1920, and this is where they had and raised their 9 children.
So, where did they grow up then? What part of Missouri did they
And
live in before they moved to Hannibal?
yes, it was Lincoln County, down near in the country, but down near Eolia, Missouri.
All right. So, how much was your family history sort of passed on to you from older generations, and how much have you had to sort of dig to figure out for yourself?
Well, I probably did more digging and the exploring and had to find out for myself. However, I should say this, there were lots of family albums, and there were lots of with lots of photographs, and my mom was even a scrapbooker, and she carefully cut out and arranged anything about any Black person here in the local area, and she did that for probably 40 years.
Wow. So, is that one of the is that partly what inspired you to start Jim's Journey?
Well, probably because it's probably just a sense of pride in African American contributions, achievements, struggles, hurdles. It probably did motivate me some.
Well, because it sounds like you had a lot of material to sort of get you off to a good start. If she was scrapbooking so much and saving a lot of articles, that must have been a good foundation for you to begin with.
Oh, absolutely. It's been wonderful. The person the Black guy who, Tommy Marcellus, who served in 2 world wars, and various obituaries that I could go back through and see who birthed who and all that kind of stuff. So yes, it was a great source for me.
So, tell us what was your basic idea when you decided you were going to start the Jim's Journey? What was the core idea that you were working with for that?
Um, it was probably more intentional in that I was driven. I hope I'm answering this right, but I'm driven to tell this story because I know stakeholders and the community um, powers um, weren't doing it, weren't going to do it. As a matter of fact, in all visitors bureaus, that they all have this history of the community, and there was really no mention of the enslavement. And Hannibal had like 2,000 enslaved people. You know, they landed here with Moses Bates, the founder, but Hannibal had no real recognition of those people and those contributions.
Right. I mean, there have been black folks living in Hannibal from the beginning, uh,
Oh,
and yet uh,
absolutely.
and yet there's very little that the town museums or historic sites have to say about the experiences of the black folks who've lived there.
That's true. And here's the real truth. I, in doing this work, have discovered so much, much, much. I mean, about our businesses, about when and where they were, and who had what, and who did what, and I discovered we had a black newspaper here in 1914. It was a weekly, and it was published by one of our ministers, but created to do what I'm doing, do some uplifting. I mean, there's a lot of reporting about the crimes and the negative things, but this publisher took it upon himself to take it in another direction.
Wow. 1914. So I can't. Yeah, I have a copy of your book, Hannibal's Invisibles, which I have finished reading, and there's some really fantastic stories in that. So why don't we just sort of go through some of the history of the local community, and let's go back to the very first African Americans who lived in Hannibal. What do you know about who those first black folks were in Hannibal?
Uh, I came across several formerly enslaved people who participate in the slave narratives. That program, that WPA program created in the 30s to give folks jobs, writers and photographers, those kinds of folks. Well, one of their main charges was to go around the country interviewing formerly enslaved people. And they landed here in Hannibal, and there are at least 5 people that are on that list who get to tell their stories. And the really funny thing is, what they tell and who they talk about in those narratives. From that, I can figure out who their descendants are, and I can figure out who the descendants of their owners or the enslavers were. So that's been a bevy of information. Jacob Lowe, as a matter of fact, one of the people that came with Moses Bates, the so-called founder. He was probably an old man, but he got to write his story, and it was published in obviously one of our earliest newspapers here. So I get a sense for him, and he is what I would describe as one of our pioneers.
So, what did you learn about his life? What did he describe about his experiences during that time?
Well, he was only 14 years old when Bates bought him from a person out of Virginia. And he mentions 3 other people that came with him. He talked about the work they did clearing the land and building those first log cabins. Um, and you know what? Like many, I'll say it that way, many of those slave narratives and those people that talk, some of them talk about the horrendous and the horrible behavior of the enslavers, but it's kind of matter of fact when they share those stories. They don't, it's just was life and the way it was, and that's what you kind of get from from their tellings.
Right. So he was 14 and he came with 3 other people. Do you know anything about the other 3 folks who came with him?
Well, not as much. We do know their names, Jemima and Robert, and forgive me, I'm not going to remember the other name, and I swore not to do that. Because
That's all right.
what I try to do at the museum is give these folks names, not make them invisible, if you will. But at any rate, we do know those names, and I have those names on full display at the museum, and because there are no last names or anything like that, other than the Jacob Lowe, there are no last names. I can't I can't research them or find out anything more.
Right. That's part of the struggle with documenting, particularly when you get back to the period of enslavement. Enslaved people were essentially invisible or nearly invisible. It's very very difficult to learn much about their lives or even their identities from that period of time, as I understand it.
Oh yes, my mom. This is so interesting to me. My mom was born in 1921. She had neighbors who had been enslaved. I mean, obviously they'd been enslaved as children, but that was their reality. And it seems like they took the shame of an they took the institution of enslavement upon themselves as an embarrassment. And we're kind
Really?
of, let's not talk about those days. Let's not talk about that.
Wow.
So,
Interesting. So they were embarrassed to have been enslaved.
yes, like it was, yes. And in fact, that's kind of why we moved away from calling them slaves. We call them the enslaved because I think uh, in my reading, it turns out that a slave may suggest that she was at fault for that somehow.
hmm, well, the burdens people carry with them, right?
Hey, now I also am a firm believer that evil is in our DNA as well.
Yeah.
You can't be an overseer and have 10 children and not have some of that going on in their heads, in their blood, in their DNA.
Right. Right. Well, so for Jacob, then, do you know who he had descendants that were still in Hannibal after?
No, no, I have
All
not
right,
been able to find that out.
all right,
No, I haven't been able to identify any of those people. I should say it that way.
all right. But
But
you
I
do
do
know
know
of.
he stayed and died here in Hannibal. Well, just
All
like
right,
Daniel Quarles, the prototype for Jim. He lived, the emancipated Daniel Quarles lived and died here in Hannibal.
all right. Are there markers for where they're buried?
No, no, no. I can't find a death certificate or anything about Daniel Quarles. But I will say we have a cemetery here. It's called Old Baptist. And since there are other enslaved people, slaves that are buried there, and there are United States colored troops buried there, I'm going to guess that that's where he was buried.
Right.
And now this is so funny to me in that in that period, the post emancipation, we had an undertaker. I don't know how he supposedly got his training or anything like that, but his death certificate identifies him as an undertaker, and and the death certificates of some of these people also give him that props for doing that service. So
Wow.
I think that's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about sort of the neighborhoods then in Hannibal, where post-emancipation, where African Americans lived. As I recall from the book, there were what, three or four different sections of town that were African American neighborhoods. Just
Oh yes, yes, we had. Well, I told you I grew up in Douglasville, and then we had what was called the West Side, and I'm going to say it this way: that's where the more prominent Hannibalians lived, because it stayed. It took a long time to turn that black. There were a lot of white folks that hung in there, but it was the West Side, and it's where a lot of our entrepreneurs and ministers and um, teachers. It's where a lot of them lived. And then we have the Bottoms, which is similar to Douglasville, being the working class, but uh, the floods, the Bottoms. By that I mean it was right in the floodplain. So the floods came, they left their homes, the water receded, they came back, rebuilt. It's just that kind of space that was also an African American neighborhood. And I will say this: redlining was a thing here in Hannibal. Well, like everywhere, but at any rate, not only was there redlining, but there were also sundown neighborhoods here in
oh,
town. We knew. We were taught where it was safe for a Black person to wander into and where it was unsafe. And unsafe meant you, obviously, there was going to be some name calling and, some bloody noses and, all of that. But our parents, and I say that's more insidious than the signs. Our parents had to teach us where it was safe to go and how to behave.
Right. So you had these black majority or black only neighborhoods in the city, and you had parts,
Yes,
the rest of the city that might have been okay for you to visit during daylight hours. But once the sun started to to go down, you had to get out of there and go back to your own neighborhood, essentially.
absolutely. Yes, I have a friend of mine, a white woman, who lived in one of those neighborhoods, and she said her deed actually said that if you have a Black person even working for you, be sure they're gone by sundown.
Wow.
So it
Goodness. I
was
don't know if
real.
I'll, yeah. Do you have a copy of those deeds by any chance at the museum? Have you ever had a chance
You
to
know,
get a
I
copy
I
of one of those?
should I do know that owner, and I should reach out to that person. I'm gonna make a note of that.
That would be a valuable document to have because I think a lot of people are unaware of just how deep and how institutionalized those practices were. So, well, let's talk a little bit about daily life then in Hannibal for if you're African American post emancipation. What were some of the opportunities that were available to you?
Well, it was pretty limited. Uh, for example, I have a 1927 color directory, and in that directory, it talks about a population of about 20,000 and about 4,000 Black people. But within that, there are 72 cooks and 25 chauffeurs. I mean, so we know what they were doing, what we were doing. So that kind of document actually highlights it for us. Another thing that directory had, and some death certificates I've come across, we had our own fire department. We had to have our own mailmen. We had to have our own policemen. In the earliest days, they were called watchmen. So we were indeed a community within.
So you had to create your own institutions and essentially too, and your own.
Absolutely.
You had
Yeah.
your own
Grocery
stores and
stores. Yeah.
yeah.
Eh, I read um, a newspaper article that talked about one of the white grocers here. And it talked about how he sold the oldest meat he had to the Black people. I mean, it was pretty powerful discrimination, if you will.
Right. Right. So I get, yeah, if you were a young black person who had dreams of, I don't know, becoming a scientist or, doing something ambitious of that kind, um, probably you wouldn't necessarily think about staying at Hannibal, I would guess then, huh?
Oh, absolutely. You were encouraged to leave. Two things come to mind. My stepfather, my father-in-law, born in 1909, said encouraged all five of his children to leave because if you stay here, I'm quoting him now. If you stay here, they're going to want to give you an apron or a broom. And again, that was just his reality and his the lesson, if you will, that he taught his children. And then now, even today, if you have a kid that you know is bright and has um, goals and aspirations, you're going to lose them. They're not going to stay here. They're not going to be here. Even though it's changed some. I mean, there's one person that works at the bank, and there's one person that we just for an example, we had one Black council person here in the 80s. Um, when she termed out, they skinnied the council down from 12 down to 6. And since then, we've not had another Black council person. The school principals, while there are more schools, elementary, middle school, high school, there has not been a high school principal since 1959. So, I mean, the more things change, the more they stay the same. That's a reality here. So kids with any kind of gumption are going to leave.
What was it at one time? Something like 25% of Hannibal's population was black, and now it's a much smaller portion of the city's population.
Oh, yes, it's more like 5 to 7%. So, with that, Dean, it's amazing that I even am able to do this work
Right.
because we don't have the numbers to demand it. So it's an interesting thought. I'll just say it that way.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit too about some of Becca in those post-emancipation and those communities. Let's talk a little bit about some of the cornerstones of the community. Then, what were the places that were kind of the foundations of community life? If you were living one of those in Douglasville or the Bottoms or one of the other black communities in town.
Yeah. Well, Douglasville, it's really interesting. It had not only was it the first black community of formerly enslaved homeowners, but that's where our first log cabin school, one 3 room, no, one 3 grades, 1 room school was built. It's where our first church was built in Hannibal, 1837. 8th and Center Street Baptist Church. In our oldest city directories, they refer to it as the African Church. And, some of those other places on that tour that I spoke with you a little earlier about, uh, there is the notion that all of our business were in this little section of town called the Wedge. But it turns out that's not true. We were all over town. We were part of the what they now call Hannibal Historic District. In fact, I point to a building on the tour. The address is 318 Main, and while there is a sign on the building that talks about the age of the building and uh, the businesses that were there, they make no mention of the fact that a black man owned it. Name He was called Texas Joe, and he had a cafe and a hotel in that building or on that site. But at any rate, it's things like that that I get to point out, and folks like that I get to uplift.
Right. Well, you mentioned the schools too, so tell us a little bit about that school history too. Is that you had there was segregation in education right up until Brown versus Board of Education, if I remember right. Um,
Correct.
so there was a single grade school and a separate high school. How did that work for Black folks?
In the early years, there were as many as 3 little elementary schools. Uh, and then they built the high school in like 1880, something like that. And from 1880, I'll say for the next 5 or 6 years, there were those 2 or 3 little 1 room schools. And then those were gradually closed, and and my parents is who I'm talking about, went over down then to our big, huge Douglas School, an 8 room brick building that was built around that time. It was it was beautiful structure as far as I can remember. I went there through the 3rd grade, and my experience is very different from some of the other people that I talk with. In my book, I have like 2 or 3 90-year-old women that I interview, and their experience with Douglas is very different from mine. Uh, but it was all about not only teaching us reading, writing, and arithmetic, but they taught us morals and ethics and mainly how to behave. Because someday,
Hmm.
particularly that the class I'll say from the 1950s. They knew integration was coming, so they spent a lot of time teaching us or teaching those kids how to behave when you go over to the white school. And here's the wonderful thing about those kids that went over that first class. 5 or 6 of those kids made the oh, it was honor society. That's what it was called back, and I think they still had that. But at any rate, so they had been properly prepared to make that transition. And that, I find that that's just so beautiful to me. And I came across that in once they went over the first few years, they stopped publishing even the white yearbooks. And I don't know why, but they have these things called newsletters, and newsletters. And I found those. And in those things, it's highlighted who excelled in sports and or academics. And there we are on all those lists.
Wow. So I'm curious now about this. What were they teaching the black kids about how they were supposed to behave? What were some of the lessons like? What were they trying to get? How were they trying to get kids to behave once they became with schools were integrated?
Well, one thing that kind of comes to mind, you could imagine the poverty that was the reality of those times, particularly for black people, but for everybody. Everybody was struggling, is what I contend. Small little town with little manufacturing and few jobs of any substance. At any rate, one woman told me that the main thing this their teacher harped on was be sure you take a bath once a week. Be sure your clothes are clean. Be sure remember your manners. Yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. So those were the early lessons about
Right.
behavior. And
So the Douglas School, so that school was for black students from basically kindergarten through high school. Is that right?
well, we didn't have kindergarten back then.
All right.
First grade through high school.
First grade through high
And
school.
but we had some feeder communities. That's what makes it so crazy. From as far as 30 miles one way, black kids came here to Douglas to go to school. And some of them boarded here with families, and some of them caught rides. And one a group from New London and that part of the Marion County, they actually caught a little train. A short line is what it was called, to get here to school. Um, and that's interesting to me. I wasn't aware of any of that. I just know I as an individual walked and stood in front of the white school so I could catch a bus to go to the colored school.
Right. I was going to mention that I think that was one of the lines I remembered from your book is that the pointing out part of the absurdity of this whole arrangement is you walked a mile to go to the white school that was the closest school to you, but that was just so you could get on a bus to ride another 5 miles to get to the Douglas school, right?
Yes. Oh, that's crazy, but that was the reality. I
Right. And then
might I may not be I may be off a little bit with the distances, but I will tell you this, it was in all kinds of weather. We didn't get snow days back then. So
right. So you were around during that period. You were going to school at the time the Hannibal schools were integrated.
I did. I integrated. I went over to the fourth grade. The only
What
little
was
black girl in my class.
wow?
I feel like I didn't get called on when I raised my hand. I feel like I didn't get picked for dodgeball. I feel like uh, 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 you can imagine, Dean, you've met me. I was a rising star in the black community, in our little black school. And then I go over here and I'm almost ignored. So it wasn't,
Right.
and I think a lot of black kids felt that way. It just wasn't a great experience. In fact, one of my friends, a classmate of mine, another black girl, she went to another school, and we liken ourselves to rape victims. I don't remember hardly any of the teachers. I don't remember hardly any of the kids. I don't, it's just all kind of a blank.
Right. And it was like that throughout your educational experience in Hannibal all the way through high school?
It may have gotten better in high school, but not so much better. We were not cheerleaders. We could join the pep squad, and anything that was up to the individual, they had no choice but but to accept our expertise, or our contributions, or whatever. But if it was kind of a team thing, you weren't going to get picked. It was no cheerleaders, no quarterbacks, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
And in sports, the rule was uh, three on the road and two at home on the floor at one time.
So explain that. What does that mean exactly?
That meant, a basketball team that has five people, right?
Right.
Only three blacks could be on the court at one time. And
All
at
right.
home, it was only two.
Wow. Wow.
Oh, yeah. Well, there were booster clubs. There were, but that's real. In fact, look up that term. You can Google it. I think that first black basketball coach down in Texas, I think he's the one that broke that rule. There was a movie
Mhm.
about him. I'm not very good about remembering movies, but
Hey, Dean Klinkenberg here, interrupting myself. Just wanted to remind you that if you'd like to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that is set in places along the Mississippi. My newest book, The Wild Mississippi, goes deep into the world of Old Man River. Learn about the varied and complex ecosystem supported by the Mississippi, the plant and animal life that depends on them, and where you can go to experience it all. Find any of these wherever books are sold.
So what was your educational experience like then? Were you just pretty much expected to read the books on your own and get through the material on your own? Like how much assistance did you get to learn, especially compared with the white students in those classes?
I don't know that it was that blatant, but I did learn on my own. In fact, my husband and I, we talk about this a lot. We graduated from that school. We were able to excel in college. I was able to get accepted into the University of Michigan, which is a pretty decent school, and I did well there. I mean, so it must have been all right in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
But if you
Or
were
you're just one of those highly.
borderline, ask your question.
I was going to say, but or you're just one of those motivated people who was going to succeed. But anyway, you were saying so for if you're a
Well,
borderline.
if you were borderline or needed that extra assistance, you didn't necessarily receive that. And there were a lot of kids that dropped out, and there were a lot of kids that I think it was easier to do it back then, that just opted out of school.
Mm,
No high school for them, all that. So,
right.
and it may have been for a number of reasons. Some of them had to work, didn't feel like they had the right clothes, the right, whatever. And then some of them, after they got there, learned that they weren't going to get any kind of support or help. Those were the dropouts as well.
Right. Did the economic opportunities open up any after the schools were integrated?
Uh, Maybe, but let me say this. On my list of notables, I have people like the first one that got hired at Social Security office. I mean, it was those kind of little baby steps. In 1970, I think, yeah, 70, I was the first black waitress hired at a white restaurant. We were always in the back, but there I was front facing, and they didn't play that. I mean,
Wow.
and so I did get some insults. I mean, it was, yeah, but that's Hannibal. And I keep saying Hannibal. I think it's every community. I think my story is universal.
Right.
And I don't think it
Right.
has to be rural. I think it urban areas and
Right. Yeah, we're not trying to pick on Hannibal in particular here. Like these experiences happened in a lot of communities around the country, and not just in the South.
yes.
Well, this is the Mississippi Valley Traveler podcast, so I have to ask a little bit about. And I think you had a little bit in the book about this, but can you just talk a little bit about like the relationship that you've been able to ascertain about Black folks and the Mississippi River in Hannibal?
Well, I think we think of it and we embraced it more for sustenance. I mean, as we fished, there was no boating, there was no skiing, there was none of that, and very little swimming. As a matter of fact, I can. We got admonished, definitely don't go swimming with any white kids. But at any rate, no swimming or anything like that. But the fish fries and all that stuff stands out as I think about the river, and I think about the fact that those fish fries, they went into things like scholarship money and church anniversaries. I mean, that's what the river meant to us.
Mm-hmm.
And we ate everything that I didn't because I just didn't. But most people ate everything that came out of that river, the eels and the bullhead to something and the carp and all these things that everything came out of there it was going to get eaten. There was no fish and release.
Right. Right. Well, it's a good way to supplement your diet, right? Like, especially if you're struggling financially, then you catch some fish, and that's free food. And I'm sure people came up with their own spins on how to cook and prepare many of those fish
Yeah,
as well.
yeah. And we were big foragers and big hunters.
Hmm. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so I think you wrote in the book some too. You had a little bit about advocating for change, and I think there was a story about the time that George Wallace, the former Alabama governor and one-time presidential candidate, came to Hannibal. Okay, can you tell a little bit about sort of that movement to advocate for broader change in the community, and then a little bit about George Wallace's appearance in town?
I think movement might be an exaggeration.
Hmm.
He came that with the Klan was definitely a part of our background, our landscape, if you will. They invited George Wallace here in 1968 when he was running for president. Excuse me, president, and his event was at Central Park. It turns out, however, that while there were plenty white folks, and I don't know any of them, I can't figure that out, but there were about 200 protesters. And I was just out of high school. And I was one of those protesters that was there. Me and all of my cousins and brothers and neighbors. And, we were there protesting. And I'm going to say we were loud enough or demonstrated enough that they were, I don't know if the word is intimidated, but they did not have a parade they had planned for the next day. So we felt good about that. That made the Associated Press. And so I get to show these pictures to my grandkids of me there in the crowd protesting George Wallace.
Wow.
But I don't call it a movement. That was the one incident. And I don't know of any other. I don't know. Well, I was gone, so I can't testify to that. But I know that since I've been back, I have been involved in several protests. One having to do with the um, um, climate change, another having to do with George Wallace, and then more recently having to do with the current administration.
All right. Yeah.
So we are more active now. But
Mm-hmm.
there was a whole period in there where we were looking to DC and those other folks to do it for us.
So there wasn't much going on locally to really push for much change.
Not that I recall. We did have an NAACP,
Mm-hmm.
and that was, I'm not sure how active or they were or anything like that.
I imagine a lot of people felt it was probably risky to them to take much of a stand. You know, economically, maybe even to their physical health, or the threat of violence was always there. Were those considerations?
Oh, I'm sure they were. Yes. But nobody actually spoke about it. Not that I can recall.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? It was probably because we didn't have the signage. It just probably made it easier to not to protest, not to be involved in the civil rights movement in a big way.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, let's talk about a couple of the people that you mentioned in the book too. That I want to just give us a sense about who they were and what their lives were like. You mentioned Joe Douglas, who's the namesake for the neighborhood that you lived in. So tell us a little bit about him.
Yes, I know that he died at 102 here in Hannibal of ptomaine poisoning, eating pickled pig's feet. I know that he lived on Hill Street in Douglasville, and I know that I've been able to acquire or been able to create a monument to him over there. So we have that. And I know that he could not have been Injun Joe, like the city still claims, because he didn't get here until 9 years after Twain left.
Hmm.
So Samuel Clemens at that time, 9 years
Right.
after he left. So that's the end of that story. But the community, the stakeholders, the folks that run the cave, the folks that run the trolley, they all still refer to him as Injun Joe.
Huh. So he was able to acquire some property. Is that right?
Yes, yes. Not far, not so far from downtown, where most of the settlement went on. So yeah, but little plots of land over there, and that became our those that space became our homes and where our first schools and churches were built.
Mm-hmm. So, what kind of background did he have? He had access to a little bit of money, at least, to be able to buy the property. Do you know much about what his work life was like?
Oh, I know that he was called a hostler. That's what it says on his death certificate. And I've been able to I've decided that that's like a baggage handler at the river. And you can imagine how much work, how much activity went on there. Cargo on and off the boats and, all of that. So he stayed busy enough and he got paid for his work, as I understand it.
Mm-hmm. Maybe even had a chance for some tips from a few people if he was carrying
Oh,
bags on and
yeah.
off. But yeah, that was back at a time when Hannibal still had a busy riverfront. Huh?
Well, we're busy now. We have the cruise ships and we have a new pavilion there and, so we're trying.
Right. All right. So he was able to purchase all those this section of land, and then I guess he started subdividing it and offering lots to people to live on or build their homes on.
That's it. That was the way I understand the story. That's how I understand the story.
Hmm.
And
And about
I mean, we're very fortunate. We have city directories dating back to 1859. All those are digitized, so you can see where people lived and worked back then,
mhm,
and who their neighbors were.
right.
We're very fortunate to have that.
Well, let's go on to one other person you mentioned too, and I recognized his name because I went to college in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and when I was working on the history section about La Crosse for my guidebook, I found a book on African American history in La Crosse, and his name was mentioned prominently. So it's George. I'm going to say Page. Is that how you pronounce his last name? P O A
No,
G E.
George Coleman Pogue.
Pogue. All right.
We
So
uplift him as the first Black Olympic medal winner.
so tell us a little bit about him. So he was born in Hannibal.
Born in Hannibal, 1804. 1884. I misspoke. Uh, his parents were enslaved people here. The Pogues was his father, and he belonged to a very prominent family here. They're the Pogues, and they own car dealerships, and have done well for themselves once they got out of farming. At any rate, him and his mother, she was actually again from Rawls County, a little Perry, Missouri. Uh, he had the father had the wherewithal to leave Hannibal uh, when George was only 4 years old, and so he packed up his wife and George, and I think it was two sisters, and they all moved to La Crosse. He
Hmm.
was La Crosse is interesting. Well, you've read the history. They had a lot of black barbers there,
Hmm.
and they seemed to have done okay. He went to an integrated school, and he was one of the first to go to University of Wisconsin. Uh, I probably read the same thing that you said. Excuse me, that you read, that talked about how being only one of 100 blacks was so different, and his background is so different from his counterparts. I'll say it that way. That were still here in Hannibal. He was able
Hmm.
to do all those things, but he also didn't have the support of a strong black community. There were no Masons. There was no black school. There was, whatever he did, he just did with his own, from his own wherewithal. And he and his both of his sisters, they all graduated from the integrated schools there. And he once he graduated from the University of Wisconsin, he was recruited to do the Olympics 1904 in St. Louis. You know that Olympics was very, very segregated. And if you read a man named, I don't know, Our City is Crying, I think is the name of the book. Have you read that?
I don't think so.
Well, he talks about the Olympics, and they had black people as pygmies and on display. I mean, just all, and it was the attendance, all that was segregated. We could only go one day a week or something. At any rate, he participated in that, and he just stayed there in St. Louis and taught at Sumner for a couple of years. And
Oh.
then he moved to Minnesota, I think, for a couple of years, and ended up in Chicago, where he died. I wish I could visit his home. I have the address where he died, but I have not visited that site. It looks like it's right there on the lake shore around that area.
Hmm.
Um, Worked as a mail sorter at the big post office there in Chicago for a number of years.
Oh
Um,
wow.
and he does have descendants that return to La Crosse on occasion.
Hmm.
Uh, I think they went when they unveiled this huge 30-foot bronze sculpture to dedicate it to George Polk, and they named a park after him. The
Yeah.
interesting thing about the park, and I just learned this from one of my visitors to the museum, is that the park used to be Hood Park. So I don't know uh, how how generous they were in doing all that. But at any rate, that's what I've learned, and that's about what I know about it.
All right. So, what was the sport that he medaled in the Olympics?
The 400,
Mm-hmm. I probably should do a whole
and I
nother show
think the
sometime.
800. I think there were hurdles. Is
All
it
right.
called a hurdle? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Have you been to La Crosse to see his monument?
I don't remember seeing that. So, yeah, I think the next time I still get up there once or twice a year. So, I will need to find that the next time I'm
Oh
there.
yeah, and the park, Hogue
Yeah.
Park.
Yeah, I'm not sure I even knew about that. So, yeah, I got to look those up the next time I'm up there.
Well, when I
Uh,
was doing the research for him, I reached out to their chamber. As a matter of fact, they have T-shirts, George Polk T-shirts.
wow. And so that name is still there around Hannibal. Those are uh, cousins or relatives or something. The car dealer you mentioned.
Oh,
Uh, th-
those are the enslavers. Those are only the white people. There are no
all right.
black folks around.
Okay. All right.
Oh no, no, no.
That's what I was curious about.
Yep, yep. That's who's left here.
All right. Well, let's go on to one other topic, and I'm kind of looking at the time and thinking we're going to wind down here a little bit. But I've got to ask about this. You grew up in Hannibal, at Hannibal schools, went through the Hannibal educational system. I'm just sort of curious, as a kid, like when you were growing up, what do you remember hearing about or learning about with Mark Twain?
Uh it wasn't it wasn't a lot. I remember reading, I think it was Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn. Well, I'm obviously not remembering, but in the 11th grade, it must have been Huckleberry Finn because I remember the embarrassment of having to read about Jim and having to use the N word in the classroom. And
Hmm.
again, I feel like the enslaver in that the shame was on me and not them for chuckling or thinking uh, thinking it was opportunity to take advantage of some name calling. Uh, and I didn't necessarily, and black people here still don't necessarily think a lot of Mark Twain. I talk to my contemporaries and they call him just an old white man who was an alcoholic. That's how they kind of think of him. They
Wow.
don't, I mean, not the literary giant that some people see. But
Right.
I will say this, I went away with that thinking because everything was all about Twain. And I had to kind of unlearn that and come to appreciate him as the first white author to make an enslaved man a person, a man, and give him children and make him a mentor to that little white boy. And then all of his essays are way more valuable and tell us way more about Samuel Clemens than any of his children's books. So at any rate,
Mhm.
I've come to appreciate him, and that's kind of what I do in the Black community. I uplift him as much as I can.
Right. So it's interesting because it kind of sounds like, yeah, especially like from that school experience, if you're you kind of come away with this feeling that he isn't somebody relevant to your life. He's just another part of the uh, white institutions that are demeaning your life. Uh, but there's not much of a sense beyond that, maybe, for who he was or his status.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Mm-mm.
How do you think Hannibal presents Mark Twain today? I put you on the spot,
Um,
and you don't have to answer if you don't want to. That's all
well,
right.
two things I'll say. The former director who's since retired, when I approached him about adding Jim's Journey to their list of options in terms of learning about Twain, he said that our story is all about Tom and Becky. So he rejected me outright. The current director is younger, not quite the scholar about Samuel Clemens as this other guy considered himself to be. But at any rate, I know that she recently invited a high dollar consultant in to talk about how they can retain tourism at the level that it was. And I was definitely on that list of people that the consultant wanted to reach out to and wanted to embrace. Because I contend it's a missed opportunity. Jim's Journey could bring a whole different group of tourists into Hannibal. They don't uplift me like that, but they have come to include me more. And I'm talking about Jim's Journey.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and my feeling all along has been that there's sort of almost a Disneyland approach to presenting
Yeah.
Mark Twain in his books in Hannibal, and I don't feel like that's a very accurate portrayal of who he was or what he even wrote.
Mm-mm.
So I wish that they would. I wish the city would embrace a little more complicated view and a more nuanced view or complete view of what Twain was and what he wrote about. I think the museum does okay. I need to go back there and look again, but I kind of felt like the last time I was there and I went around the whole museum, it seemed like they had a pretty good. I thought they went in pretty good depth, but uh, but yeah, I think there's plenty of room to do more and get beyond this oversimplified child's view of Mark Twain.
And I will say this though, I've also admonished them about the images they have of Jim. The first I guess artist showed Jim in kind of a demeaning uh way, not very flattering at all. Kind of
Hmm.
like the Aunt Jemimas.
Right.
And when folks started changing the appearance of Aunt Jemima, I contend that they should have started changing the images they have of Jim, but they haven't and they won't. So that goes on and on.
Right. Well, so we do have some control over, like, steering people to the right places. So tell us, if you're a visitor coming to Hannibal and you want to learn more about African American history, where should they go?
Well, they've got to come to Jim's Journey, the Finn Freedom Center, 509 North 3rd Street. But hey, wait, Dean, I think they'll also learn here about Clemens the humanitarian. I have a whole slew of people that I talk about that identified that he interacted with or he wrote about. And he wrote about many of them in a very flattering way, and he uplifted many of them. You just gotta you just gotta have maybe an open mind when you're doing that
Mhm.
reading.
Right.
But at any rate, Jim's Journey's always available, and I do a lot of private tours, and we do have a website, jimsjourney.org.
All right. Do you have any social media profiles that people could check out? Facebook, Instagram, anything like that?
I have a Jim's Journey Facebook page.
So, what are your hours? What are the best times to catch Jim's Journey open? That
Again, I'm open Friday and Saturday 11 to 5 and Sunday 1 to 5.
All right. And you mentioned the website. I will post a link to that in the show notes. Are there any other things that you would recommend people do if they wanted to gain a little more insight into African American life in Hannibal, besides obviously the mandatory stop at Jim's Journey?
I'm not sure that I can say there's much in Hannibal, uh, you know, tangible, and there are no other institutions or anything like that. But I will direct them to read James. I enjoyed that the new Pulitzer Prize winning novel about Jim, the another sequel to Huckleberry Finn. And then I loved My Jim. It's by a woman named Nancy Rawls, and it's Sadie's story. And she does a beautiful job in there of telling us, teaching us, sharing with us what life was like for the African American female, the mother, the wife, the woman. Um, and it was somewhat different than it was for enslaved men. So she's going to be highlighting that for me when she comes on June 27th. And then on June 28th, we're going to have some readers doing some excerpts from the book. I have recruited a man and a woman. They're both storytellers. So I've recruited them to do some readings for us, and that should be interesting.
Fantastic. I will. I'll share those on my social media accounts too, so the word gets out about those events because that'll those events will take place before this podcast is live. But yeah,
Oh,
those
okay.
sound fantastic. And if people
All
want
right.
a copy of your book, Hannibal's Invisibles, how can they find a copy of your book?
Well, I encourage him to go to Belt or Arcadia Publishing. But if you want to be lazy, you can do Amazon. It's they all have copies available for like $25, I think.
All right, I will post links to that as well in the show notes. Faye,
All
thank you
right.
so much. Thank you so much for talking with me today and sharing your experiences growing up in Hannibal and sharing your stories about Black life in Hannibal. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today.
Good. Dean, thank you for thinking of me and being interested in all this.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the series on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss out on future episodes. I offer the podcast for free, but when you support the show with a few bucks through Patreon, you help keep the program going. Just go to patreon.com/Dean Klinkenberg. If you want to know more about the Mississippi River, check out my books. I write the Mississippi Valley Traveler guidebooks for people who want to get to know the Mississippi better. I also write the Frank Dodge Mystery Series that's set in places along the river. Find them wherever books are sold. The Mississippi Valley Traveler podcast is written and produced by me, Dean Klinkenberg. Original music by No Offense. See you next time.